Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, my guest is Yoav Ganbar, and Yoav has been a computer geek and techie his entire life. However, his professional tech journey started somewhere in late 2009, so he's definitely been in this game much longer than myself. And during kind of university, he was a webmaster for the Israeli Museum of Comics, and not long after that, he found himself doing SEO, marketing, e-commerce, consulting, and odd kind of dev work, and sometimes as a freelancer as well. And he's also passionate about the web, educating, teaching, mentoring, and talking about web development in general. Hence, he's kind of joining me today. And then he's also the co-host of the Fed Bites podcast. So definitely recommend you guys going and subscribing to that if you are kind of listening to this via podcast as well. And yeah, that's kind of what I have for Yoav here. So is there anything I mentioned or missed in that intro, or anything that you want to add or correct there?
Oh, well, you kind of pass on almost the past decade of work on startups and stuff. And yeah, in my current position, I do developer relations for Builder.io, who is a company that created Qwik.
And that is going to be the topic of our discussion today, which is Qwik. So I personally don't know a ton about Qwik. I'm kind of a beginner, definitely, when it comes to it. So this is selfishly going to be a podcast for my learning, but hopefully for the audience that doesn't know much about it, they'll get a good idea of it as well. So I think a good place to start is just like, what is Qwik?
Okay, so first of all, you're not alone at this, right? Qwik just hit V1 early May, so this is still adoption is still incremental, and people are still getting a chance to use it. We have a few people that we know of that are using it in production. But to start us off, really, let's talk about what Qwik is. So Qwik is a new JavaScript framework. It is a full stack framework that allows you to create instantly interactive web apps. Okay, that is like the basics of it. Now, it uses JSX, similar to React, and that's how you write your templates, basically. But there is a very big difference in kind of how the mechanisms work. Like, the most key difference of Qwik compared to React and a lot of other frameworks that are out there is that Qwik does not use hydration. And hydration is a process of all front-end frameworks, which basically is to reattach event listeners after they do server-side rendering, right? So, for example, you discussed that you use Next.js. So Next.js is a meta framework, again, and meta framework or framework and how you kind of define it is a whole subject of discussion, right? But Next.js, right, is a meta framework for React, basically allows it to do server-side rendering, but it also leverages nowadays with Next 13.4, leverages the app router and React server components. So Qwik in itself is a whole framework. There is a meta framework, which is Qwik City, that is in charge of routing, bundling, the building steps, and kind of how we cache stuff and prefetch stuff. But the most basic idea of it is, again, it does not use hydration because it uses this new concept called resumability. And there are only two other frameworks nowadays that do that. And one of them is an internal framework that Google uses called Wiz. And this is what powers like Google search and Google products and all kinds of stuff like that. So basically what you search in your search box, and then you have all these carousels. So if you search for a product and then you have carousels, but if you search for like a mathematic equation, you get the answer. So that is kind of what powers that. It's not a framework like React or Angular or Vue, because the experience for something like that would just take a whole lot of time because of this whole process of hydration. Because the process of hydration, what it is kind of the way that frameworks that came into this age of the SPA age and kind of needed to work around a way to do server-side rendering was basically doing all the work, generating the HTML on the server side, sending it to the client, but then on the client, they kind of need to re-execute all the code to get all the event listeners attached and make the app interactive. Now, Qwik uses a different kind of mechanism, which is resumability, as I've mentioned. And resumability is achieved by serializing everything into the HTML that is sent down the wire to the client. And other than that, the actual entry points, unlike hydration, which kind of have one entry point for the app, and then there's a function that calls other functions that creates all the components. In Qwik, the entry points are actually the event listeners. And the way this happens is by resumability, and resumability is kind of the best way to think about it. Okay, there are two ways to think about it. And let me stop me if I'm rambling a little bit too much, right? So one way to think about it, and this is so also worth mentioning, the creator of Qwik is Mishko Hevery, the creator of Angular and AngularJS, and co-creator of Karma. But also working on the project is Adam Bradley and Manuel Meida, who used to work at Stencil and Ionic, and nowadays all of them work at Builder, working on Qwik. So the one way to think about resumability is like a VM. This is the way Mishko likes to think of it, right? So if you're not familiar with VMs, which are virtual machines, it's basically a way to kind of programmatically start an environment, like a whole Unix environment or Windows or whatever on like your computer, but then have it on a file, right? So you could run a whole instance of a machine. And for example, you could go into this machine and open up a text editor, start writing whatever document, and you could just hit save, and you can pause that VM at that specific state, and then transfer that file of the VM to your friend. Then your friend can just start that file, and it'll be right where it stopped. It'll resume right from that point, meaning it doesn't need to boot up like the OS anymore. It doesn't need to start that app for the document. It basically starts from the document from right where he stopped typing and just resumes. So that's kind of one way to think about it. Another way to kind of think about it, and this is how I like to think about it, and also we have Shai Resnick, who was helping us with DevRel on Qwik, and he coined kind of a term that he liked to think about it as JavaScript streaming. Okay, so, and the analogy of streaming comes, okay, so back in the day, before all streaming services, right, that we know, Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, whatever, the way that you would need to kind of play a video on your computer is you'd actually have to find a file, right, download the whole file, wait till it finishes downloading, and only then start watching it. Contrary to streaming, where you can start watching a movie online, you get chunks of that data, right? And you get just the next kind of few scenes, and you can pause it at any time, right? And then you can go to another computer, log into your account, and keep watching it from exactly the same spot. So this is kind of how resumability works, is you only get the chunks of JavaScript of interaction you need when you need them. It's lazily executed, not only lazily loaded, but lazily executed. So a click listener, for example, would not have to execute until the user actually clicks on a button. It will have that file pre-cached, like prefetched by our smart optimizer, which basically runs through like all the structure of the HTML during build time, and kind of, like I said, it serializes everything into the HTML, and then kind of leaves markers as to where each kind of module resides within like the whole build process. So then it breaks down everything into little chunks, and it keeps those markers inside the HTML. So then once you kind of start up an app and you want to click a button, so that exact HTML element of a button will have kind of a marker to where the file that needs to run the JavaScript is. And that file would be already in the browser cache, and it will just execute it once you click. Unlike, again, in the hydration process, where actually the event listener of the on-click needs to be put on right after kind of the HTML gets to the user's browser, and then has to reevaluate and then kind of say, okay, let's do all the old DOM stuff and attach event listeners, and then there's a whole mechanism, and it's different in every framework, right? React has synthetic events, which are not exactly DOM events, and Svelte has its own thing, and Vue has its own thing. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Gotcha. So let's just see if I'm understanding this correctly, and then maybe what I'm not understanding. Hopefully you could fill in any gaps. So to me, it sounds like Qwik is a framework that also uses kind of JSX, kind of similar to React, to generate the HTML and kind of add interactivity with JavaScript and stuff like that. But the kind of core difference, it sounds like, is that with Qwik, you use this concept of resumability that prevents you from having to go through this hydration process. And that's good because the hydration process, it sounds like it takes longer because it needs to re-execute your code to kind of add the interactivity to your app. To whereas with Qwik, you can just kind of pause or you can resume to add that interactivity where it's needed and reference that cached JavaScript file. And then you can have that interactivity in place. Am I somewhat understanding this?
The beauty about Qwik is you don't need to think about it. Like this whole process I explained to you is not something that you as a developer need to know about. It's nice to know about, right? It's interesting how things work behind the scene. But the thing is, you just write JSX, you just write your on-click event listener, and then it magically does all these things for you, right? It automatically knows to break it into little chunks. It knows when to load it on time, and it just is ready to go as soon as you boot up the app. That's the basic of it.
And yeah, just trying to understand how it kind of works, just for like the benefits of why someone would use this over kind of React or Next. So I think that kind of moves me into a question I also had is, it sounds like Qwik has potentially performance gains over React or Next. And, Next definitely tries to pride itself on being super fast and doing other optimizations as well. So how would you kind of compare Qwik to React or Next, and why might someone decide to use Qwik versus kind of these other library, or versus like Next? And maybe there's use cases in which you might use one or the other, or how you kind of think about Qwik versus maybe some of its kind of competitors, so to speak.
Let's start off by the fact that Next.js is an awesome framework and React is a great library, and I've used it most of my career. I've been using Next.js since like version 2, I think. Yeah, way back when. And I think like the key difference is they're nuanced, right? But the key difference is Next uses React. React has a certain way of doing things. Again, it always, described itself as a library and not a framework, right? And Next.js is kind of the wrapper that makes it into a framework. And let's not get into React server components and how they change a little bit the paradigm. But the basic idea is the pendulum swing, right? Back in the day, like Rails, PHP, Laravel, all those were server-side rendered applications that used the web server to generate you had a templating system that generates the HTML, and then you'd add interactivity on the client with JavaScript, usually jQuery. Again, this is going back 15 years, and that has worked, and it still works, and it's amazing, and it's great.
Just a random side note, jQuery is actually still used in a lot of applications. I think there was a developer survey on how much jQuery still exists just online in general, and it's actually like a remarkable amount of websites and stuff still have some sort of jQuery in them.
Yeah, it's like 40 or 50% of the internet is still powered by that. Yeah, all the world WordPress sites, right? Because that's how you get interactivity in WordPress sites, because it's PHP based and then you need interaction. So the way it still works is jQuery, and a lot of people have not been updating the WordPress instances, right? So back to kind of where I started. So I'll tell you this. I used to work at a startup, which was a travel startup, very content focused, basically a glorified website. It used to be a WordPress site, and I came on to that company to basically move the site from being a WordPress site to being a React application. At the time, when I joined, of course, SEO was paramount there because all of the traffic, like 90% of the traffic was organic traffic that came through SEO. So it was really important to keep kind of all the structure and all the ways. And so we couldn't go down the single page application route because, right, search engines don't like that. So I was lucky enough to kind of discover Next.js back then. And it was great, and it worked amazingly, and we moved the whole site to Next.js. However, after about a year or two, Google started with these very interesting metrics called Core Web Vitals, right? And Core Web Vitals, to our listeners who are not aware, are the metrics that Google uses to rank your site's performance, to kind of understand where it ranks in the search engines, right? There's more factors into this. That is not the only factor, but is one of the key factors. And it kind of started shifting towards performance more. What was it? 6-7 years ago? It became a much more prominent factor in terms of rankings. And with it, they started releasing a lot of tools to kind of help you measure this stuff. So they have Lighthouse, which is built into Chrome browser, which is a way for you to kind of measure and see what's going on with your site or app. So back in that company, don't know if you know it, still going on. The name is Culture Trip. So like I said, everything was basically articles, content everywhere. And that was the key entry point for our users into the app was through a website, then through an article, and then they'd go into the article, and then they could log in and start bookmarking stuff and kind of start planning their trip and gather information for their trip. So we were keeping tabs on our performance scores and seeing what goes on. And with due time, we were not where we wanted to be, right? We knew we could do better, and we wanted to do better. So even though Next.js was an awesome framework, again, allowed us to do server-side rendering and get all the HTML to the client, there was the problem of hydration, right? That JavaScript is kind of blocking the main thread and not getting us the scores we wanted. And as soon as you have that part, then your scores start to drop. And of course, the more code you add, the more this loading time increases. So we kind of had this initiative to try and get us, we called it going to green. We were sitting on the red, yellow in terms of scoring in Lighthouse, and we wanted to get better. So we started experimenting and trying to kind of reduce the amount of JavaScript that we're sending on the Warrior. But that was not the only case. And what we found out was that it's really, really hard to get your JavaScript bundle down. So there are all kinds of different strategies to do this, right? So it's lazy loading, like modules and components, being able to kind of load the right code for the right route we were on. And again, a lot of these things are taken care of by Next.js. However, we found out that one of the things that hurts you the most, of course, is third-party scripts. And if you're using Google Tag Manager, which is a tool that Google has to kind of basically just inject third-party scripts, so analytics and Facebook pixels and what have you not, you're not completely in control of those, right? So in order to kind of measure and also understand the impact of our work on the code, we kind of had to disable third-party scripts to kind of understand where we can go in. And this was a grueling process, right? And we had to keep on moving things around, lazy load different components in case there was some kind of, a bridge in logic between which component to load. So we wanted to make sure we're not loading two components when there's a fork in the road to decide which one. So we kind of had to work a lot, and we were 4 or 5 people working on this for about 6 months, and we were able to move the needle by, I don't know, a few points, maybe 10. And that, just the fact that we had so much hard work doing that was was what every kind of developer needs to do when they're trying to optimize for performance using like current generation frameworks. And once I got to know Qwik and understood that you don't need to do that. You don't need to kind of optimize or lazy load or do stuff like use memo or use callback, because all of that is kind of handled for you like as a feature, right? The philosophy behind Qwik is make sure that the easy path is the easy path is the performant path, and the X over best practices. So coming to realize how hard it is to kind of gain a little bit more in core web vital scores and lighthouse scores when working with the current generation or previous generation frameworks. And again, we're kind of in this third age of JavaScript, so I don't know how to refer to this completely. But it's really hard work. And when I kind of got to know Qwik and understood what happens behind the hood there, of that I don't need to go and lazy load my component or my modules to kind of, I don't have to manually type like with Next, and there's the dynamic import. And so I don't need to go and for every file or component I want to be lazily loaded, do dynamic, add a little bit more. In Qwik, it's as simple as just wrapping your component with component $, and that's it. That's your boundary for something that would be lazily loaded and lazily executed. So it'll only execute a component code only when it's there, when it's needed. Unlike what I had to do before was kind of find it, do it, put it in, and kind of manually type a lot of code.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to that story as for my current professional job, been there about 4 years now, and I think right around year like 2 or 3, we have a very small team as well, like 4 or 5 developers, and it's a startup, and we had the goal of increasing our lighthouse scores, exactly what you said, and I was kind of the front-end developer there and had to kind of like do a lot of this. So I know how tricky it can be with even when lazy loading components, and we were just using create React apps, so we weren't even using like Next.js or something like that, but similar thing to where lazy loading and tried to do use memo and preventing like certain dependencies to different packages, so you didn't load up different code you weren't expecting, and like it's definitely a process, and you know, it's definitely months worth of work. So if you are able to use something like Qwik to where you just kind of get the stuff out of the box and you don't really have to think about it, and just based on the structure of Qwik and how it kind of does things, you automatically get these performance gains. I could definitely see that being super beneficial there. So I think you've definitely sold me on Qwik being beneficial, but
there is a way to think about it, right? If you want to go computer sciencey on the terms, like most frameworks they got a complexity of O of N, right? Because the more code you add, the more loading time you're going to have.
Qwik linearly scales.
It linearly scales. And Qwik is an O of 1 because it only loads the JavaScript it needs when it needs it. So it's only, I got a JavaScript, that's what I'm going to load and going to execute. Got another piece, I'm going to load it and execute it.
And if you ever see like any graphs of something that performs at constant time versus linear time, it's a huge difference on the performance between the two. And that especially matters more the more like you have a large code base and the more kind of professional your application is and stuff like that. So with that, we are coming up on time here, but maybe real quick before we end, if someone wanted to use Qwik within a React app, is that even possible? And I think that you also have a good article kind of touching on this, which might be a good place to kind of direct people to go to get a more in-depth understanding. But can you use Qwik kind of alongside like a React project, or how does that kind of look?
So currently you can't use Qwik within a React app. You can't. It is possible technically, right? You could load kind of the quick loader script and inject it into React. But then you're still bound to React and React's rendering model and its whole way of working. So the benefits will not be as obvious as if you would use Qwik as your root application and load React within that. Because Qwik, the way it works, again, it's Qwik and Qwik City together, the meta framework, and it has an optimizer that is built in Rust. That's basically the compiler. So a lot of 90-something% of things happen during build time. And that what is the major benefit of it? Again, this is kind of similar to how Svelte approaches things, right? They have their templating system and their compiler runs, and it spits out the minimum amount of JavaScript that it needs. So in order to use Qwik and React side by side, we do have an option of kind of using React within Qwik. And what this allows you to do is basically leverage the whole ecosystem of React, or just bring in your components that you're already built in React and use them inside Qwik. But the beauty is when you use it inside a Qwik application, then Qwik will basically statically render your React components, and you could also control when the hydration process of React will actually be initialized. So you could do it only when the component is visible, only when your browser is idle, or only when you hover over like a button or your component. So you have fine-grained control over there. What else is you do not have to opt into React's reactive mechanisms. You could use what Qwik has to offer, which is fine-grained reactivity using signals. So you can basically pass in a signal, which is your reactive piece of state, into a React component, and just let kind of Qwik handle all that. And with fine-grained reactivity, the beauty is that unlike React and unlike, I guess, Angular as well, again, I don't want to say things I'm not sure of, but with React, for example, the way that reactivity works there, right? So you have your piece of state, your use state, your use reducer, or whatnot. Every time your state changes, it re-renders and re-executes the code of the component. And then the whole DOM tree and the whole piece of that component needs to re-render, and it basically has a whole virtual DOM diffing and trying to understand which part changed, and it basically flushes it and replaces it. Like that, with fine-grained reactivity, which is mostly implemented via signals, and which are prevalent and also inspired by signals in Solid, and Preact also has them. It only changes the DOM node that it is attached to. So if you have a counter and you have a span showing that counter, only that span, that text node within that span that has that value is what is going to kind of re-render, and not the whole component.
It sounds like, so for my professional company, we use a Create React app. It sounds like if we wanted to use Qwik, the process would be we would first have to create a Qwik application, and then kind of bring our React components and our logic kind of over to that application. Mm-hmm. Does that sound correct? Or are there ways to kind of incrementally adopt Qwik, or how might that kind of look?
So your approach would be the correct way. You could, again, like I said, you need to have the root of your application be a Qwik application. So you would need to start a new application, but then you could just incrementally adopt by just moving specific routes or pages. But if you're saying you're using Create React app, then you could basically just take your whole application, create a new Qwik application, take your existing React code of the whole application, basically wrap it within the React Qwikify function, just Qwikify that, and render it into the root of your app. And that'll just take over, and then you can say, okay, only load this when you hover the get started button, and that'll start up the whole React. And React will take over with this whole mechanisms and hydration process and whatnot. And again, hydration is a process that only happens when you server-side render React. So in your case, it's not going to even be a thing. But again, React needs to execute, kind of boot up the app.
Gotcha. Well, very, very interesting conversation here today. Definitely giving me some more things to look into and kind of review about Qwik. And I think that Currently working on like a course in Next.js to kind of get that out. But I think after that, Qwik is definitely going to be something that I explore in depth further and kind of get a better idea on how it works and kind of the benefits and trade-offs that we kind of talked about today as well. So kind of with that, if people want to stay up to date with what you are doing, feel free to give the podcast a shout out, your articles a shout out. Where can people kind of go to find you here?
Okay, so you can find me on Twitter with at my handle @HamatoYogi. If anybody wants to understand why that is my handle name, you're welcome to just ask. You can find a lot of the stuff I put out in terms of articles in the Builder.io blog. So we try to put out at least 2 pieces of content a week. We have a newsletter that I write and kind of publish it. Other than that, you can check out my podcast, Fed Bites. It's on all the audio apps. Still need to kind of get back into the game and record a few more episodes. And other than that, you can find me also on my website, hamatoyogi.dev. I get like cross links from all the things I do here and there. And unlike Ryan here, who I visited his website, I try to keep mine updated.
Yeah, sorry guys. I haven't looked at my website in like 4 years, so do not recommend you guys even go in there, to be honest.
Maybe try a rewrite with Qwik.
Hey, that sounds like a good idea. That would be a good chance to kind of learn it and do that. So
yeah, just like one final thing that I want to mention about Qwik is it is a multi-purpose framework. It supports SSG, MPA, SPA, everything. It also supports MDX, Markdown files, and all that fun stuff. So it basically has everything you need. So for like a blog
Perfect.
or anything, but it very much shines with highly interactive applications. That's where you see the biggest bang for your buck.
Right. And that probably goes back to that hydration aspect of hydration, adding that interactivity. Well, with Qwik, you have this resumability aspect of it to where you don't need to go through that process. So awesome. Well, this was an awesome conversation. Selfishly for me, I learned a ton. So hopefully the audience did as well. So thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.